So today I'm just going to really welcome Jackie to the Lunchtime Seminar. This is the second Lunchtime Seminar Jackie has done for us. Jackie has been involved with CSE throughout her career. Working as a probation officer in England, she specialised in therapeutic interventions with adult male sex offenders. She worked in Barnardo's NI for 20 years, developing the work and resources around sexual exploitations of children and young people. She established a service to tackle this. She has lobbied on issues for many years and has developed training and presentations on the issue, excuse me, to over 4,000 professionals, politicians and the public. And now it's our turn. Jackie, I'm going to hand over to you and I'm going to stop sharing and let you share, and it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And could you just confirm, Alison, if you can see that?
I can see it, yes. You may want to go into presentation mode, Jackie.
It is. Can you not see the full screen?
Well, we can see your notes as well, but there's it's grand, you know.
Shouldn't, but there aren't any.
No. Well.
Hold on, let me try again. That should just be the full screen.
Right. Well, I can see your screen and your note screen as well.
Sorry about that. Try this again.
Try it one more time.
Too many screens open. How's that?
That looks better. I think that's you ready to go. Thanks, Jackie.
Okay. Thank you, Alison, for the introduction and welcome everybody. Great to be here in my dining room. Alison introduced me a bit, and some of you may know me, some of you may not. Just to reiterate, I suppose the core of my work around child sexual exploitation was with Barnardo's, Northern Ireland, for 20 years, developing the work around that and training, research, etc. I no longer work in that field. I left Barnardo's 2018, and 2 years ago I joined the Presbyterian Church in Ireland as head of safeguarding, so cover the whole of Ireland in that. So I'm actually delivering this seminar today independent of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. But it is based on my research, one element of the research that I did for my doctorate before leaving Barnardo's and just after. Before I start into it, I do want to say, and I say this in every training session I do, because it's all about safeguarding that I deliver on. I appreciate that talking about sexual abuse issues, sexual exploitation, I don't assume for 1 minute that everybody feels absolutely comfortable with that. So this is a word of caution that at any time if you feel uncomfortable at all, please do take time out. Don't sit and suffer in silence. Take time out and look after yourself. So just a word of caution there before we start in. So yes, I had the opportunity to do a doctorate through the University of Bedfordshire, and having worked in the field of CSE for that number of years, what became apparent to me during that time was that I witnessed young males rarely being recognised as victims of abuse and responded to with more immediacy as perpetrators, really, of sexual abuse and other crimes. So when I had the opportunity to do the research and look at a subject area, it didn't take me long to actually decide my aspiration was to achieve a greater understanding as to the reasons why there were barriers both to young men disclosing the fact that they were victims of sexual exploitation, but also to look at what were the impediments to professionals actually recognising that. in doing that, I'm focusing on boys and young men. I wasn't for 1 minute intending to disregard or diminish the impact of CSE on young females working in the service. Some of you may have known it. It was first of all Beyond the Shadows, then Safe Choices, and now it is, I think it's called Seen. I mean, the majority of referrals we were getting in there were females, young females, so quite well aware of the impact on them and the factors surrounding their sexual exploitation. And it actually became clear during my study that whilst there's several barriers to disclosure and identification, may be considered unique to young males, many of those others pose the same difficulty as young females. So there are both similarities and differences there. So just going to, oh, this isn't working. Slides not moving. You got that okay? Yeah. First of all, I just want to say what my overall research aims are, because again, this is just one small element of it. It was to identify the barriers to disclosure of CSE for young males and to identify those impediments to identification by professionals. What were the blocks there? What was preventing them identifying it? And to consider if there was any relationship between those two phenomena. So those were the overall research aims. It was a UK-wide study. Okay, mixed methods approach was used. I wanted to get the best outcomes for the study, and I thought the best way to do that was to explore it from a number of perspectives. That necessitated me hearing from professionals and from young males themselves, and generally young people. So there were UK-wide 91 professionals completed surveys, which I produced. 30 participated in one-to-one interviews, and I was able to interview 10 young males across the UK. Okay, 4 of those were in Northern Ireland at that point in time. What I also wanted to do, first of all, what I wanted to say was the young males in particularly, I wanted to speak to those who had knowledge of CSE in their past or the present circumstance, social circles. But I also wanted to speak to or hear from young people from our general public here in Northern Ireland, and Young Life and Times survey facilitated that. So we had a return of 1,158 responses from those young people. The professional interviews included 18 participants. Out of that 91, the 30, 18 were from Northern Ireland, okay? Of those, 28%, that's 5 of them, reported paramilitarism as a specific issue in relation to the sexual exploitation of young males. Now, I'm going to say to you, and I know what you'll be thinking, that's not a lot. Only 1 of the 4 young men interviewed from Northern Ireland reported paramilitarism as being a relevant factor in non-disclosure of his own exploitation. But what I want to say is that the whole issue of paramilitarism wasn't a predetermined area for my examination in the study. It came up as a matter of fact when I was doing it. And whilst those numbers may not seem that significant, big, the significance of the actual qualitative accounts by both the professionals and the young male absolutely warranted its inclusion and analysis. So I I was glad to hear that. I was glad to get that information. I thought it was vital to include that, and I'm glad to be able to share that today. I do want to say at this point, folks, that, and I know you're seeing a blank screen at the minute, and that's fine. What I want to say at this point is I am not saying I am any way an expert in paramilitarism and the complexities around that. This simply came up, and I know reading the literature, particularly here in Northern Ireland, there are so many experts out there in the field who I've quoted in my research, but I've read even more recent accounts dealing with young males, particularly in paramilitaries here in Northern Ireland. And we've heard and seen some more of it in the media more recently. So I just wanted to highlight that I'm not an expert. I'm simply conveying what was brought up. What I want to say just in terms of the data limitations of this, the study didn't seek, three data limitation points I want to make here. The study didn't seek to distinguish young male victims of CSE who are members of paramilitary gangs and those who are not, but simply reside in paramilitary controlled communities. Okay. Statements by research participants making the links between sexual exploitation of young males and paramilitaries didn't clarify whether the abuse was wielded by gangs or by individual members of these gangs, and nor were participants specific to which paramilitary gang they were referring. Okay. And thirdly, neither the study nor this the study didn't debate the nuances of paramilitary gangs against the definitions provided. In fact, when I actually went to look for a definition around paramilitaries, it was very difficult to find. Suffice to note one distinct feature, and that is the predominance of adult male leaders within the paramilitary gangs. I want to highlight that. And the significance of this is the potential heightened dynamics of power and control exerted over others. So it wasn't my intention to detail the entire complexities surrounding the sexual exploitation of young males within the realms of paramilitarism. But what I want to do is begin to address those believed to impede the recognition of CSE young males within that context. Okay. Whilst there were those limits, and they certainly require further investigation, there was some evidence that there can be, first of all, a direct impact on young males from sexual exploitation perpetrated by individuals with paramilitary connections, and also an indirect impact through fear of living in communities under paramilitary influence as a victim of CSE. And some of the quotes from professionals and the young male I'm going to share with you later very much demonstrate that fear. Okay. What I needed to do was to look at the policy context in Northern Ireland around this. So obviously Cooperating to Safeguard Children Northern Ireland addresses the sexual exploitation of children and young people, and as well as defining the issue and how it presents, the Cooperating to Safeguard Children outlines how organisations, how we all need to work in partnership to ensure these children, young people are nurtured and safeguarded as effectively as possible. It talks about domestic, physical, sexual and emotional abuse, neglect and exploitation. Notably, that guidance also acknowledges the additional vulnerabilities faced by children and young people, and I quote, living in a post-conflict society which is still experiencing legacy issues associated with paramilitarism, and that shouldn't be any surprise to any of us. It recognises that within some communities, there can be an acceptance of the use of violence as a response to perceived antisocial behaviour, crime committed by individuals, or as a method of control over children and young people. So that the guidance highlights that children may be abused and exploited by adults who hold power within their communities, where fear is used to coerce the child or young person into compliance. And we have seen that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, though there are a lot of debates about it. We have seen that more recently with our concerns about children and young people out in the community and riots and who's influencing that. The other document I want to talk about, or just mention really, is the Children and Young People's Strategy 2019 to 29. And that's the overarching strategy in Northern Ireland. From that flows a variety of cross-departmental multi-agency plans, topic-specific strategies and programmes. Particularly want to just mention the Fresh Start Agreement 2015, and within that, also linked to that, the Action Plan on Tackling Paramilitary Activity, Criminality and Organised Crime 2016. So, you know, the Fresh Start Agreement sets out the Northern Ireland Executives Committee to Tackling Paramilitary Activity and Associated Criminality. And that includes very much the prevention of vulnerable young people being drawn into that and addressing, it actually specifies addressing underlying issues that increase the risk of young males becoming involved. Then the Action Plan on Tackling Paramilitary Activity. Again, much work going on there, I'm aware of, and included the development of initiatives to ensure that schools, youth groups, etc., dealing with the effects of paramilitary activity in young people can identify what's going on and work through that. So lots of activity going on through around that. So that's just highlighting some much more, but those are the key policy areas I wanted to draw on. So in terms of the key research findings, just want to touch first of all on what the literature was saying. It talked about the links between gangs and CSE, the recruitment of young males, punishment attacks perpetrated against young males, and concerns around the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, 2016, something that they mentioned, which I will come back to each of these in turn. Okay. First of all, the links between gangs and CSE. There's very much in recent years been a focus in England in particularly on the links between gangs generally and CSE, but it's focused a lot on England. You can read more in my full research on that if you wish to. But the studies around that reveal that females, there's a lot more known about females as victims of gangs and much less known about young males. Talks about the knowledge of the dynamics and the complexities within the culture. The gang culture provide a significant learning about the factors that act to impede the recognition of sexual exploitation, particularly of young males. So we have that generally. The literature was focusing then also on the recruitment of young males and what that meant. And we can see, and again, many of you will be more expert in this than me if you're focusing in on paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. Many of us have lived through it. But from the late 1960s, obviously Northern Ireland did experience a sustained period of violent conflict. And that remained part of this political landscape until the mid-90s. we know about the conflict, the issues around national identity, all of that. The evolution of paramilitary organizations, it originated at the start of that, and it was very much, Harlan very much talks about young males being actively recruited into paramilitaries, even in those early stages. And during that era, from the 60s, late 60s to the mid 90s, the figures that are quoted in terms of punishment, shootings and beatings, there were over, there were over 3,000 punishment shootings and over 2,500 punishment beatings by paramilitary organizations during that time. I think of significance to my particular study is the degree, then you can easily see the degree of fear generated and the power exerted by these gangs, together with the fact that 25% of victims of those punishment attacks were perpetrated against those young people under the age of 19. And we still hear this. And I know the Children's Commissioner's Office and others have raised issues about our children and young people, and they are children sometimes, receiving these punishment attacks and shootings. It's still happening. So just to focus on that again, I've done that bit. I suppose on that, because of all of that and the punishment attacks, the UNCRC in 2016 raised issues regarding the extent to which Northern Ireland was meeting its obligation as a signatory to the UNCRC. In 2016, they actually expressed concern that in Northern Ireland, children were facing violence, including shootings carried out by other non-state actors involved in paramilitary style attacks, as well as the recruitment by non-state actors. So the committee recommended something at that stage. And they said basically we needed to take immediate and effective measures to protect children from violence by non-state actors involved in paramilitary style attacks, as well as from recruitment by such actors into violent activities, including through measures relating to transitional and criminal justice. So very clearly saying that something needed to change, and that was 2016. Okay. Some of the recent evidence, and this is from my policy briefing on this, which I'll tell you more about at the end. You can see there, there was in 2017, again, there was a Young Life and Times, sorry, not Young Life and Times, there was a Life and Times survey conducted with 1,203 respondents, and that was around paramilitary influence and activity in Northern Ireland. Just this is literally a snapshot of what I thought was significant to give context to what I'm talking about, the fear and the influence of paramilitaries, and particularly with young males. 15% of those people, those respondents, agreed or strongly agreed that paramilitary groups created fear and intimidation within their area. 14% agreed that there was a controlling influence. 22% agreed or strongly agreed that paramilitary groups contributed to crime, drug dealing, and antisocial behaviour within their area. Probably no surprises there if you're reading up on all of this stuff. In terms again of the attacks, paramilitary style attacks, from April 1998, which time of the Good Friday Agreement, to June 2015, there were 2,732 casualties of paramilitary style attacks. 89 of which were children under the age, who were age 16 or under. Again, I emphasize children. In terms of young people, aged between 16 and 24, there were 1,297. And then 1,346 adults aged over 24. And you can see there at the bottom, 20 out of all of those numbers, 20 prosecutions and 5 convictions. Okay, just want to touch on then the significance of paramilitarism to my study, bringing it back to this. And I felt, this was the significance really both during and post-conflict was threefold in terms of what I was looking at, boys and young men and victims of CSE. What it did was that whole post-conflict context created an environment which reinforced masculine ideology. And very much in my overall study, masculine ideology came up time and time again as impediments to recognizing young males as victims of sexual exploitation. So this was seen as, this kind of environment was one of power, and is one of power, strength, aggression, and protection, giving young males a place as defender and protector of their community. So we can still see that very much, I think. And with this came status amongst peers and community members. Secondly, what it did was establish a climate of fear and control, which silenced victims of CSE. And that could have been a result of several things. What I found was paramilitary figures being the perpetrators of exploitation, a general fear of disclosing within such a threatening environment, a culture which did not permit the involvement, particularly in years gone by, that involvement of statutory services and or a distrust of statutory bodies tasked with actually protecting those children, young people, especially the police. So all of those factors very much present there in terms of that climate of fear and control. Okay. Even some of you may be aware of Kathleen Marshall, who did the a study research into sexual exploitation generally here in Northern Ireland in 2014. And her report, there's a bit in it where it actually says, we were told very clearly that paramilitary influence, where it is apparent, may cause and facilitate CSE. And this undoubtedly makes it difficult for people to report it to the statutory authorities. And I can say, hand on heart, working in the field of CSE for 20 years, the issue of paramilitarism with the sexual exploitation of children, young people came up time and time again. And because we were working most of the time with most of the referrals were young females, that issue came up in terms of them being controlled in this way, but very, very difficult for anybody to put a finger on or get any disclosures specifically around that. All of this established was a culture, and what I came across, Pitt's research, he's done a lot on gangs, particularly in England, and he referred to an involuntary affiliation to gangs. And I think that's what we can see here in Northern Ireland, very much so, that involuntary affiliation. And it's evident when we look at control, and I'll look at that in a minute, control, constrained choice, and the whole, again, impact of fear, just coming up time and time again. The third factor that was significant to this study was the longevity of the conflict. Again, for those of us who've been around for a long time throughout this, we realise this. And what that did was help embed and normalise a culture of violence. We still see it. And that ranged from an acceptance of it to actively seeking out conflict and violence within other communities. Again, Harlan talked about that. As a result, paramilitary violence was accepted as it's just the way it is in our area. And you'll hear that when I share with you some of the quotes from participants. We're hearing that time and time again. It's just the way it is. It's the way our life is. So very much that need to break those cycles. Okay. So going to start in now. I know Alison said there, but I'm going to start in next to the actual field work and what participants were saying, but maybe an opportune time to maybe stop. I haven't seen any chat come up, Alison. There's nothing yet.
No.
I'm quite happy to take one or two questions if anybody has any at this point.
Hi, yeah, I just sent you a wee question on chat there, but maybe you didn't get it.
No,
my name is Andrea Bingham. It's okay, that's okay. My name is Andrea Bingham, and I work for Youth Justice Agency. And when you mentioned there about the kind of the masculine ideology, I was just wondering how that fitted in with CSE on young boys, and perhaps, I mean, maybe it is more to do with the power issue, but that, you know, would that not have been seen as maybe, you know, with like within those communities where men and men together in those sorts of relationships are frowned upon and are seen as, you know, and I was wondering how that masculine ideology fits in with, you know, how their communities, you know, view gay relationships and how they kind of kept that in tandem within their heads. If it's very much a masculine ideology, whereas on the other hand, they were sexually abusing young boys.
Yeah. It just highlights the whole complexities of it all, Andrea, very much so. And some, you know, both the professionals and the young male we were talking to very much said that. It's like, you know, in any community, in our society generally, masculine ideology getting in the way of young males disclosing that this is happening to them for lots of reasons. But then you're in that masculine type of culture as such within those communities, which adds yet another layer to them actually being able to talk about this. And, you know, there's so many other factors come into it, whether or not it's maybe happening to several young men in one community. Do they know that it's happening to others, or are they of a mind that this is just happening to me and I can't talk about this? It's very, very complex and just adds layer upon layer to that inability to actually talk about it. The whole masculine ideology as well, if you want to look back at my first briefing, it's based on the kind of full research, and it very much talks more about the masculine ideology and what the inhibitions there that creates in disclosing it, and indeed professionals recognizing it.
Jackie, there's a few questions. Can you see them on the chat?
I can't.
There's one from Christine. I wonder about the impact of drugs and addiction and trauma in the mix.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if Christine wants to say anything.
Yes, absolutely. And again, both in terms of this area and paramilitarism, but also generally with boys and young men. Again, if you want to go back to my research and look at that, there's specific bits. I actually cover it here a bit too about use of drugs as a measure of control by paramilitaries and others. But also that use of drugs to numb the pain of what's going on for them. So it's it's complex in terms of drugs and trauma and all of that that young men have grown up with, and that I suppose the trauma that their parents, their grandparents, all of that they've experienced and that they're living with within their communities.
Okay. There's another little question. You want to answer a couple of these now, Jack?
Yes,
or,
yes.
Jackie, yeah. Okay. All right, just jumped on me there. Okay. Is there any indication of male rape being used as punishment by gangs and paramilitaries?
Again, I, in terms of my research, so I'm not speaking from that, there was nothing coming out, but I think with gangs generally, some of the literature, and this is maybe more GB based rather than Northern Ireland, although there's nothing to say it's not the same here, that rape is used, can be used, has been used as a means of threat within groups to get people involved in gangs, as you know, in various ways of threat or whatever, or kind of that ownership, that coercion into gangs. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Again, PITS is a good one. If you want to look into that more, there's going to be more, plenty others as well. But I think he's written quite a bit on gangs.
I can't see Adele, but Adele, hey, you put a couple of wee messages on. Do you want to?
Thanks, Alison. Yes, I suppose one of the issues was around men having sex with men, for example, in prison, but also known to be the case in psychiatric hospitals as well, and they don't consider themselves to be gay. And I think it's just really, it's it's important not to misunderstand homosexuality with child abuse, you know, and I think that the notion that it would be considered to be a gay act, I think there's been other messages that have been put in the chat already, emphasizing that it's, you know, it's an issue of power, and I guess the conversation that we've just heard there has clarified that. But there are also known to be paedophiles that have been sheltered within certain groups and paramilitaries as well, where victims are intimidated and not able to report crimes due to so-called paramilitary connections that the perpetrators have.
Absolutely, yeah. And say, hopefully some of the quotes I will share with you now will really demonstrate that. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for making that point. Absolutely no way should we associate, you know, homosexuality and homosexuality, child abuse, and that. This is very clear that the professionals and the young male I spoke to, it was exploitation. It wasn't necessarily about wanting to be in a homosexual relationship, but those added difficulties were as well within that, you know, that again we're back to the masculine ideology that where a young male wanted to maybe be in a homosexual relationship, the fears around that as well, and how he may be treated. Yeah.
One more wee question, Jackie.
Yeah.
Kira is wondering, in the research, was there a strong link in families, as in generations being involved in trauma, paramilitaries and CSE?
What was the first part of it? Is there a link?
Kira, I'm wondering, in the research, was there a strong link in families, as in generations being involved in trauma, paramilitaries and CSE?
Yes, that was certainly coming out, and again, I've some, I think, good quotes probably in this that will reflect that, and it's back to that point earlier I made that, you know, this is just the way things are. This is what we've grown up with. The trauma certainly there, but not necessarily people recognizing that as trauma. This is just the way it is, and hopefully it'll make more sense when I come to it, because I will talk about how things amongst all of that trauma, things are just normalized. This is the way life is. That violence is normalized.
And the last one, I'm not really, Sinead, do you want to mention anything about your wee message on the chat? Can't see her. So Sinead's just saying in her experiences, it's actually a male power thing, and the majority of male sexual abusers are heterosexual relationships. The sexual abuse of young males can be rite of passage in whatever settings, which is usually an exclusive male setting. So she's just put that wee message on.
Yeah.
Hi, Alison. Thanks for that. Sorry. No, do you know what? Actually, a call was coming through and I was trying to kind of
Sorry.
get myself off the loop. No, you're actually right. Here at NSPCC, we offer a therapeutic recovery service to children and young people who've been sexually abused. And, you know, it is that kind of that sense of a rite of passage. We have had young men who were in an all-male work environment, a traditionally male work environment, such as a garage, and the abuse took place there. And it was that, and it was a lot of the men there that were all involved in that, and there was a leader in that who was married with children, but this was very much seen as a male power thing and a male dominance thing, and basically humiliating the child. But we've seen more recently as well referrals coming in relation to the school setting, where you would have kind of maybe one of the more popular young male pupils and in that gang, and sexually assaulting other boys on the bus, and then kind of labeling that young boy as gay and using really derogatory and homophobic names towards them, but they're very much asserted as an alpha male, and you know, very popular and not gay, and it's not the identity of being gay. It's the same as a child sexual abuser not being a pedophile. You know, they are interested in the power and the humiliation and their own sexual gratification, but it's not about being, you know, unable to engage in normal adult or heterosexual relationships.
Yeah, absolutely, Sinead, absolutely right. Yes. And you know, everything that you're saying there just makes me think something that I was always saying continuously when I was working in CSE. We need to be talking about this, and particularly now we need to be talking about this happening and how it's happening to boys and young men, because if we're not going to, we're not going to be able to prevent it, but they're not going to be able to talk about it and what their experiences are if we're not going to. So, you know, yeah.
Exactly, and the impact on their developing sexuality and their idea of themselves as, you know, in terms of a sexual being and their sexuality and what they have believed up until then, and what kind of confusion and anxiety it's created for them since then.
Absolutely. And without, you know, going into it more, that's where we see one of the differences. And it's not minimizing what happens to the girls and young women, but that's one of the differences for boys and young men, that that difficulty in actually, you know, a boy on the bus being sexually exploited or abused by another boy. A girl comes off the bus and says that to her parents, you know, we'll know what will happen, and we know what hopefully will be set in process. What's going to prevent that young boy actually saying that to his parents or to friends? Less likely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Discussed, yeah. So thanks for that. Okay, more questions at the end. So if I just, and again, hopefully this will add to those conversations we've had there. What I'm going to share with you now are the issues identified by both the professionals that I interviewed and the young male. And I say it was, I'll reiterate again, this wasn't intended to look at this, but there was such a richness in what they were saying, I just couldn't ignore it. So the themes coming up from those interviews were, you know, around, again, I've said it, you know, and it comes up time and time again, the impact of fear, control, and constrained choice for the young males. The fear of consequences for themselves and for others. And again, we can see there how the male ideology comes into play again, and that sense of the expectation, I need to protect others, and you know, society tells me I need to look after myself as well. But fear of the consequences for others if they do tell. The control, including through the use of drugs, the coercion to perpetrate, be a perpetrator themselves, the gains of what's happening to them, and in their view, allowing that to happen versus disclosing it, weighing that up. And I've already mentioned that, you know, moving from tolerance, tolerating what's happening to them, to normalization. This is it. This is my life. So taking first of all the impact of fear, control, and choice. The quotes are going to say much more powerful than anything I can say. One professional from social services said, there was one young man one night when I was on night shift, and he came down in tears. Obviously, there's a residential setting. Floods of tears. And then he disclosed he was in huge drug debts, and a paramilitary group were making him perform oral sex as a way to pay off this favour. The social worker at the time was involved and reported it to the police, but he didn't want to proceed with the investigation. He withdrew his statement and retracted what he had said. Social servant, the same person, said touts, that the young person believed that touts get a hard time or get beat up, especially by this known group of paramilitaries. So that young man was very conscious of the consequences for him if he didn't retract what was happening to him. And one element of the overall study did examine how offending and antisocial behaviour could be manifestations of trauma for male victims of CSE. And again, we just kind of maybe don't need to cast our minds back too far. I'm talking about young males, particularly in paramilitary controlled communities and antisocial behaviour. In the context of Northern Ireland and those communities, such behaviours can result in a young man, obviously, we've talked about it, being subject to punishment, attacks, okay? So what we see then is the role as facilitator of criminal justice, that's what they are within their own community. That was reported as ensuring compliance to their laws, to ensure alienation of police and other statutory authorities. And the criminal behaviour by others seemed to undermine paramilitary authority and their status within the communities, as well as some criminal activities, ironically, being viewed as detrimental to their own community. So what we have here is the potential to reinforce the fear and compound the silence within paramilitary controlled communities, reinforced actually by research that McAllister and others have done around 2018. Then what we also see is the punishment by paramilitaries resulting in these young people, young males, being labelled as criminals, potentially then also reducing their own credibility as victims. So how can they're labelled as a criminal, they're being sexually exploited, how can they actually come forward? Who is going to believe them? And in their own view, they're criminals, and in the view of others, really detrimental to them. So the male victim of CSE, who's then guilty of offending and subject to paramilitary attacks, is then prohibited from disclosing his victimhood on two levels, actually. one as a victim of CSE or of paramilitary punishment. So completely closed in terms of that. This diagram maybe sums that up very well. That cyclical nature. So the young males sexually exploited, they're silenced through fear, control, etc. They have that trauma. We've already mentioned it, and some of you have mentioned that trauma, that manifestation of trauma. How does it come out? We know that it can manifest itself through criminal or other antisocial behaviour. So that happens in their own communities. They're attacked because of that. They're taught a lesson. You can't do that in our community. So that further silences them. Hopefully that makes sense and kind of really demonstrates where these young men kind of are in this. Fear of the consequences for themselves and for others. Again, my study highlighted the efforts of young male victims to disguise their experiences from others. They were often fearful of the repercussions of disclosure. These young men live in these communities. They know what people are capable of. The one young male, obviously, I've given him the pseudonym of Sammy, and he described his struggle to maintain the secrecy of his exploitation. He learnt from a very young age what was safe and what was acceptable to tell, to disclose in his close-knit, paramilitary controlled community. So Sammy said, Northern Ireland has this real sense of community where we can work it out because of the way it is with the paramilitaries and no equal rights here. Everyone in the state knows everyone. You walk outside your door and everyone knows what time you left. But because of those other things, like the sexual exploitation, it's just surface level. It's, I will tell you about this and this and this, but I won't ever tell you about this. Say he had learned from a very young age what he could say and what he couldn't. He went on to illustrate a young male's attempt to protect his own perpetrator within that community. Living within paramilitary culture of violence, Sammy understood very well the potential lethal consequences for his abuser. Should he tell? And should he tell of his identity? Sammy felt he didn't really have any option. He felt he couldn't be responsible for what might happen to his perpetrator. He said, especially and he named the paramilitary area, that's all I've known. These are all manly men. And I know if I went and told my dad, him and his manly paramilitary friends would go up and kill him. I mean, literally kill him there and then on the spot. So for a young male, feeling that sense of responsibility, knowing you've caused someone's death because you've told about something happening, very, very powerful. And I think what that does really exemplify the potential pressure on young males to prioritise others, really, above that of themselves. And again, reducing that likelihood of any disclosure of himself as a victim. And highlights the influence of all the cultural complexities around this. Okay, so we've already mentioned the control, including through use of drugs. Okay. So drug issues amongst young males and females, and again, we're well aware of that in the context of paramilitary gangs, was featuring as a common theme throughout the whole of my study. However, there was that perception that it took different forms for young males and females. That should, I would hope, help us in our understanding of that constrained choice for young males. And again, a professional summed this up well, the differences here. With females, it's more about control, in that they would be given a bit of substance and here's a party. And you take a wee bit of this, love. It's less of that party atmosphere and more of this big man, hard man atmosphere, you know. You're part of our group now, and you're part of moving this drugs from here to here. And it's very much tied in like a job rather than a party situation. So I know it's not as black and white as that, folks, but that's kind of one of the distinctions that the professionals were making. I think somebody had asked the question, made a point there about the involvement of drugs and all of that, and it's not one singular approach, or, you know, in terms of drugs. I'm talking in this context, but that's just one example of it, where young males are given drugs. They're part of it now. They're complicit in what's going on, and then they're used maybe to move the drugs or whatever. So again, I think that's a good example to think about when we're thinking about working with, coming across young people, both males and females, in terms of sexual exploitation, drugs or whatever, how they're being used, who's controlling them, what's going on here, and looking at all of that in terms of risk assessing. And as any illegal activity, one professional interviewee spoke of how young males felt complicit, again, in their role of drugs. You know, I've just mentioned that. That then, combined with the fear and control that's wielded by paramilitaries, can render the young male unable to speak about the connections between the drugs and the experiences of CSE. And you know, that's not just in terms of paramilitaries, that's across the board. Once a young person feels they're complicit in something, the likelihood of them disclosing their own victimhood lessens. So again, somebody from social services was saying that whole aspect of having total control over a community, one that closes down, and that sense of the young person, they're involved with ourselves because of drugs or alcohol issues. It's very scary. They get the drugs to deal with the issues that's going on maybe at home. So they're taking the drugs to numb the pain of whatever's going on. They go to the paramilitaries, get involved in getting drugs when they don't have the money to get them. So eventually they get to the stage of, well, how are you going to pay off the debt? So they may do a couple of runs, but maybe they get into the habit and create dependency. And the aspect of that is that it becomes a greater dependency. And then I suppose thinking who would you tell? Would you believe them? So lots of issues there in terms of all of that, that dependency, and who's going to get that young person out of that. Generally in the research, other young males who became dependent on drugs, it was like they would say, you're taking away their method of coping by taking their drugs away. So we need to really look at that too when we're working with these young people. Coercion to perpetrate. By paramilitary figures and to perpetrate sexual exploitation on young females. Again, that illustrates a further dimension of constrained choice for the young male, and also highlighting the influence on professionals to recognise young males' perpetrator status rather than victim status, and And again, the young male, once coerced into perpetrating this, believing that as a perpetrator, who's going to believe me if I tell anybody I'm the victim now? That's not going to happen. So a professional from the voluntary sector said that there would be powerful individuals in the community who would organise lineups, and then there would be a fear attached if young men don't turn up and do as they were asked. Then there would be repercussions. They would be very, very sinister. They could be beaten up. Young males would be expected to perform sexual acts on girls as well. So then they look like they are the predators. But essentially, they're being controlled by the paramilitaries. So there's a very fine line between victim and perpetrator. I think, again, really highlighting our need to look at that dual, if it is dual, victim-perpetrator role there that the young male is placed in. And that example concurs with a lot of the other research findings out there. Within a gang culture, they describe young males being pressurized into performing sexual acts with females against their will. What that does then, it warrants recognition of a broader picture of the role of the young male, may be forced to play in the facilitation of those seeking to abuse young females. It's also relevant to the debate around the inclination, the side of the view young males as perpetrators. We really, really need to look at that. Trying to stop myself saying risk assessment again, but when we're doing that, or we're assessing where a young person is at in terms of their victimhood or whatever, we really need to look at that factor. In terms of their gains, again, here in Northern Ireland, McAllister and others have identified social exclusion. We know what the makeup is of a lot of our communities here in Northern Ireland, where there's the paramilitary activity. We know the social exclusion of many of the young people within that, and being marginalised. And what do they do then? They search for that sense of belonging as particular vulnerability factors pertinent to their recruitment into paramilitarism. We see that time and time again. What have they got to lose? Where can they gain? Morrow and Byrne made this statement: direct participation in violent conflict has been dominated by males from districts with evidence of persistent multiple deprivation in the age group the United Nations identifies as young people aged 15 to 19. So very much that problem already in existence. What are we going to do about it? The study overall found young males within socio-economically deprived areas as being highlighted where these paramilitary gangs primarily existed. So, yeah, as one professional noted, you've got a lot of these young males coming from very deprived areas. And I suppose a lot of the deprived areas, if they're run by paramilitaries, they are the men that are held in high esteem. And the young man I interviewed from here about this was saying very much that as well. They're the ones with the status. Again, all of this is corroborated within the literature review. Again, Harlan stating how paramilitary membership appeared to be sometimes of a mutual gain for the young male and the gang. Is that desire for a life of purpose, a sense of status and acquired possessions that's sometimes otherwise unavailable to some of our young males in these communities. And yeah, again, I can't help but think about our numbers here in Northern Ireland of young males committing suicide, and very much tying in with that need for a sense of purpose or lack of it, or what way do they turn, or what are their options in all of this? Things we really need to consider. Paramilitaries have access to guns, they have access to drugs and a lot of things that be used to lure young men into involvement in certain things. Again, you know, as I read these, I'm sure this isn't new, we know this, but sometimes actually hearing this again, professionals, young males are living with this. Maybe we just need to be reminded of this to kind of up a gear and keep doing something else about it. So again, that element of fear within all of this as well is illustrated. Sammy illustrated this really well. Element of fear as having the potential to produce a degree of complexity for young males. So, you know, on the one hand, he said, you've got a bit of both. There's the status and there's the fear. He said, I've met someone and he's really powerful. In a way, you're living the dream because you're with him, but no one knows he's buying you a drink. I think in their heads, it's not a bad thing because there's this powerful person. It's almost like this mobster's wife, you know. With the paramilitaries, I don't think it's so much as, oh, I'm so scared. It's more, I've got status now, especially if you grow up. Again, he named his paramilitary area that he was familiar with. So again, this, a young man at a juncture, you imagine, where does he turn? What are the options for him? And I suppose making us think about when and how we intervene in those situations. So considering that all in the context of identification, it is possible that status gain for the male victim, CSE, it definitely has the potential to render him culpable in the eyes of others, perceived to be choosing involvement in the gang culture, and then maybe not so much as a victim. And in some cases, that gravitation towards the gang status was seen by participants provide that sense of protection to the young male who believed this would guard him, maybe from further exploitation. It's happening with one, but maybe others can help me here that will protect me, or some other form of harm that would protect them from that. So in that way, the fear of the young male is exerted by the paramilitaries towards others and can be viewed by the male in a positive light, preferably seeking the protection of others from preferably to seeking protection from the authorities for what's happening to him as a victim. So, again, summing it up, professional said it's nearly glorifying paramilitary groups, what you see young men doing. I know such and such who will look after me when I'm out in the community, or I'll be fine down there because such and such is the head of that group. There's that protection, the status. So if I'm in with them, I'm safe. Really, you know, we think again about that constrained choice. Are they really having a choice here? What are the options for them? Similarly, again, previous gang research is also evidence the desire for status and protection as very much a strong motivator for young people, male and female, where they're seen to exchange sex in return for what they perceive to be those gains. So what I would say is that kind of paradoxical position of some young males who are victims of this may claim or appear to be claiming a degree of agency around their involvement with paramilitaries. That needs to be recognised. That inducement of power, of status and protection are byproducts of their affiliation to gangs. The coercion and the fear can simultaneously impact them. What does that leave them with? Powerlessness, being objects of control, silenced, and in many ways unable to find a viable way out of the exploitation. That was seen again throughout the whole of the research in terms of not being able to find a way out of this. How much greater is it, can we imagine it is in Northern Ireland for young males living in these kind of situations with those added dimensions and complexities? So just to finish off the last bit of this really is talking about tolerance to normalization. That was a theme emerging from the study. It showed the lived experiences of some young males generally, but particularly here in Northern Ireland, the interviewers were saying that it promoted the tolerance of cultural norms, the cultural norms that we know are here of violence, sexual violence, and that becoming normal. And such acceptance was seen as inevitable in reducing the likelihood of disclosure of CSE experiences. One example highlights how one young male victim assumed his role in life as drug running for a paramilitary group, which we've already talked about, acceding to sexual exploitation as part of that role. So this professional said, if you grow up in the wrong place, if you're born into the wrong house, he saw that he was never going to live anywhere else in his life. That was him for the rest of his days. He was never going to be employed or have proper education, but this was how he was going to make his money. This was his future. So everything was tied into this, and whatever was going on the side should be exploitation. You just had to soak it up. You just had to get on with it. That was life. Just accept it. Young men get very stuck. This is my life. This is the way it is. This is the way it was for my brother, my dad, my cousin. So that intergenerational experience of life within that same community and no sense of escape from it. The whole strength of those communities and the community structures and that pervasive control remain significant to young males despite their experiences of being exploited. Again, that explained very well in structures. That structure is really important to the young men. That's the be all and end all. Potentially a longevity thing in that the young men are maybe being primed to take over and to go into this because it's man's world. There's no women really in charge of these housing estates. Young women are only needed for sexual exploitation to a certain age and then off you go. Whereas these young men will be sexually exploited to a certain age, but then you will be staying on to help us move our money, move our drugs. You're part of this now. So it's that potential lifelong kind of thing. Sounds doom and gloom as we read those quotes and that, knowing that's the reality out there for many of our young males and indeed for many of our young people. I have some recommendations from this that I'll share with you in a moment, but if nothing else, giving you all food for thought in your own specific roles about how we can break these cycles. Each of those contextual influences present in paramilitary control environments were shown to clearly impact the young man's perceived lack of freedom, not only to reject the exploitation that's happening to him, but disclose their status as a victim. So lastly, the last quote really, what we found is sometimes what some of the professionals were saying, that whatever the young man's reason for not disclosing and the silence around it, it was very difficult. Professionals saying very difficult for them to respond to it, because there was what they expressed, many of them expressed more than an element of frustration and not being able to help these young men, aware of some of their very extreme circumstances. One professional said he was only 13 when he came through to our cells, but huge history of drug use, being found in flats in named the area, being found in his own feces, so very much gone in his functioning on a day-to-day basis, known to be around a lot of older males. There was a huge influence with the paramilitaries, and they seemed to gravitate toward known figures in the community. Again, police were informed and investigated what they could, but there was nothing substantive for them to go on, and this young man would never have talked about it. When I worked with Bernardo's, if anybody is online and knows me from then, you will know I will have said, right, so what do we do now then? What do we do? It should never be, that's it. It's what do we do then to overcome that barrier? And that's still the way it should be. And I hope more progress has been made. I'm out of the field now, but I would like to think we are still asking those questions. So that's a block. What else do we need to do? But the very, very apparent, this frustration of professionals not knowing really how to help young males disclose this. So in all of this, folks, I hope, in conclusion, really, I hope I've achieved my aim in presenting kind of an examination of the concept of paramilitarism and all the complex dynamics within paramilitary controlled communities in Northern Ireland, to which are many of our young males are exposed, particularly those who are sexually exploited. The ultimate impact of that cultural environment, which embodies, again, we said it, masculine ideology on the identification of CSE in males, and all the reasons for their silence. Hope that's been highlighted. While it's limited, it's evident from the findings, hopefully, that there can be a direct impact on young males from sexual exploitation perpetrated by these individuals with a paramilitary connection, but also that indirect impact through the fear of living within such communities. And I think a genuine recognition of this and the uniqueness of this for young males is imperative, absolutely imperative, if we are to be assured of their safety in disclosing. Again, like I've said over the years, it's not going to be achieved overnight, but I hope with everything we're doing, with every discussion, with every presentation, with every piece of work we're doing, we're getting closer to enabling this to reduce and for young men to disclose. Analysis of this whole subject concluded really that there's more known about the potential barriers to disclosure of CSE amongst young males in these environments than there is in relation to the impediments to professionals identifying them. And I feel that's an area that really does need to receive greater attention. That latter limitation highlights the significant knowledge gap. So for any of you researchers out there you go, that could be in your next subject area. there's the need for further attention and research specifically regarding professionals' identification of this sexual exploitation of young males in these paramilitary controlled communities. So just to finish off with my recommendations, what I would be suggesting is that CSE policy, practice and training for professionals should specifically consider the influence of paramilitary gangs in relation to sexual exploitation of young people, including young males. I know in producing some training on CSE whilst I was at Bernardo's, we would have talked about this. I think we need to hone in even more on it and make sure that it includes a response that reflects an understanding of potential complex trauma. We've touched on that, but really, you know, we know in Northern Ireland, many of our organisations are working with, towards becoming trauma informed. This issue cannot be exempt from it either. And that Northern Ireland executive strategy is aimed at tackling paramilitary activity by supporting vulnerable young people, including males. Should include awareness raising and training for youth workers and other professionals about the links between paramilitarism and sexual exploitation. That should be a theme throughout. Thirdly, that youth services, and I know there'll be many of you on here, should take a key role and are often best placed to create forums where young males can address issues around cultural identity, masculinity, and the need for power and protection. Again, it's back to my earlier point, we can't talk enough about this to young males in whatever forums we get the opportunities to do that. And that existing services address issues such as drug and alcohol misuse and mental health. That should be trained in CSE awareness. All of those services should. And in particular, the nuances of this for young males. And lastly, back to my point just made, further research is certainly required on the role of this whole issue, but particularly the impediments that professionals face and identifying this in young males and all of those frustrations we talked about. Okay, so I look forward to seeing the progress and all of that. I can say now, sadly out of the field, but still a passion of mine, very much so. And I'll say at this stage, you know, I'll take questions in a moment. I know we're nearly out of time, but if anybody wants to come back to me, I'll give you my details here and this will happen. I'm more than happy to work with anybody. So as well as the overall research, I have just completed the third briefing paper, this based on my research, third and final, I should say, the trilogy. This was the first one based, this is the general research, the policy briefing on it. This one, the influence of paramilitarism in Northern Ireland, which you've just heard about. And this is the latest one, the association between youth offending and the recognition of CSE in young males. Each of those briefings are available on the Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland website. There's the link there. But again, I'm more than happy to talk to anybody anytime. I thought we might have some more time. I'm happy to stay on to answer any questions anybody has. I'll leave my contact details up there if anybody wants to take them down, but happy to take questions if anybody has any more or points. And I take reasonable challenges as well.
Some people have left, Jackie, so I don't know if Andrea's still on. Well, I think she is. If she puts something on the chat, I don't know if you want to pick up on it, Andrea.
Yeah, it was just around this idea of the masculine ideology and what that looks like within communities, and how accepting people are of like that kind of masculine ideology around power and abuse. And it was just, I think it's something that I certainly will begin to challenge within my work with young men. And actually, what does that masculine ideology look like within communities? And is it that, you know, it is the way that the conflict has been normalized. To me, that abuse is being normalized as well within communities, because in my opinion, in my experience, never does it happen in isolation. So people do know about it and are accepting of it. And that's my fear, is to challenge that masculine, not the challenge, but to get young people to think about, well, what does it mean to be a man? And what does it mean to be a man in today's society, or even in their societies? And I think there's another report which I'm just reading at the minute called Punishing Abuse, which I put on there, and it's from the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner, and it's looking at, and it's 2021, so it's looking at how we respond to young people who engage in criminal activity after experiencing trauma or abuse. So that's what why they call it punishing abuse, because a lot of the young offenders, young male offenders, come in after experiencing trauma and abuse. So for me, going forward, it's around challenging the masculine ideology. What does that mean? Acceptable to be abused, and is that part of a masculine ideology? So for me, moving forward, thank you very much. It's been really interesting for me, and certainly it's got me thinking now about how better to focus the work with young males.
If you want to access the third briefing on offending and association, it talks a bit more about the trauma as well, Andrea. So you can safeguarding website, but it does my thank you, because that does my heart good to know that people are up for not challenging, but allowing young males the opportunity to talk about this, what it looks like, and the pressures on them. You can imagine as a young male feeling that pressure of maintaining that status. So yeah, thanks for that.
Lots of people have left, Jackie, and they're saying thanks, but Veronica has just put a chat on. It would be useful for future discussion to explore positive community interventions and how community development can enhance, strengthen trauma-informed approaches in this specific area.
I'm just wondering if anybody's looking at that at the minute. I'm sure there are. And you know, this maybe a question could be asked of the Safeguarding Board and the work they've done around trauma-informed practice. Which organisations have come on board to kind of work on that? I don't know, but yeah.
There's a wee question from Ruth. Jackie, any suggestions about how to make male risk of CSE more of a priority and how to talk about it with a professional?
Yeah, well, I suppose
professionals.
Who was that? Sorry, is that
Ruth? I don't know if Ruth's
still gone. She's still there. I'm just thinking back to my recommendations in terms of training people in all of that. I mean, there's going to be lots of research. Well, I say lots of research on boys and young men. There's not an awful lot on CSE. That's one reason I did it. But I think there's more out there now in terms of that. And I think training for professionals is vital, and to focus in on this. And those who are working with, particularly in forums with young males, I think have perfect opportunity to address some of those things. Yeah.
Okay, there's a big question. I did put a note on at the start. We have recorded today's session, and we do have permission to share it out on our website. So it'll probably be a few days before we get it edited, but it will be available, and we will share the link with you. Let's just go down through and see what else we've got. We'll share your comments with Jackie afterwards anyway. David, are you still here? Would you like to pick up on your wee chat? David's still here. Okay, so David's just saying thanks, Jackie, very interesting. Ken Harlan's work on masculinity is fantastic in a Northern Ireland context. The CSE can and should certainly feed into the tackling paramilitary work and communities and transition interventions. So that's what he's saying. Very interesting.
And I think given my links doing these 3 policy briefings on my research, the links with the Safeguarding Board, they can have those conversations with the powers that be who are dealing with, tackling paramilitarism and all of that. And I know they are. So they will, I suppose, have those conversations and make sure those inputs are happening, those links are made. We should come back with this in isolation, is my point.
Right. Stephen's just asking, have you shared your study with youth services? We are keen to expand the skills of youth workers to identify and work with CSE.
Well, again, that links back to one of the recommendations that youth services are really probably almost best placed to have these conversations and raise awareness with their staff as well. I'm not in the field now that I can actually do any more of that, but well, I'm not saying I can't. I'm happy to work with people in that, but certainly maybe the Bernardo service which still exists may be doing some of that too, so they can maybe link in. Again, the Safeguarding Board is that main conduit to make these things happen.
Well, I think that's maybe all the questions, Jackie. Thank you very much. I think it was a very powerful presentation, and I know people have really appreciated you taking the time to come and talk about it. So thank you, everyone. As I said, we will share the link to the recording very soon. Thank you.
Thanks everybody who's still on there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Jackie, do you want to